In 1717, one pirate commanded a fleet worth more than any sea robber in recorded history. He rose from nothing in under 2 years, never lost a ship, gave his crew a democracy. Then, a single storm ended it all. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from and don't forget to click subscribe. Samuel Bellamy was born in 1689 in the village of Hiddesley in Devon, England. He was the son of a farmer, one of 6 children, and by the standards of rural Devon at the end of the 17th century, he had almost no prospects at all. The England he was born into was a country of rigid class stratification, where the son of a farmer was expected to become a farmer, where the sea offered the only genuine mobility available to men of his background, and where that mobility was almost always purchased at the cost of brutal labor under brutal conditions. Devon had a long maritime tradition. Men from the county had crewed the ships of Drake and Hawkins. The Royal Navy recruited heavily from its coastal communities. The merchant fleet drew sailors from its ports. Bellamy, like thousands of Devon men before him, found his way to the sea as a young man. The historical record of his early years is thin. He appears to have served on naval vessels during the War of the Spanish Succession, the conflict that defined the early years of the 18th century and gave thousands of trained sailors military experience that the peace would leave with no legitimate use. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ended the war and demobilized tens of thousands of men who had spent years learning to fight at sea. The Royal Navy discharged sailors without pension, without land, without anything except their skills and their resentment. The merchant fleet absorbed some of them, but not enough. The result was the generation of men who would become the founding pirates of the Golden Age. Bellamy was one of them. He was 24 years old when the war ended and had nothing to show for his years of service except a knowledge of ships and the sea that few men on earth could match. The story that drives Bellamy's biography, the story that his contemporaries understood as the engine of his ambition, involves a girl from Cape Cod named Maria Howlet. The details are tangled between documented history and legend so thoroughly that separating them is nearly impossible at this distance. But the broad outline is consistent across multiple sources. Bellamy arrived in New England around 1715. He was living in the Massachusetts colony, working in whatever maritime capacity was available, and at some point made his way to the Cape Cod town of Eastham. There he met Maria Howlet, the daughter of a local farming family. She was, by the accounts that survive, beautiful, quick-minded, and entirely out of reach for a penniless sailor with no family connections and no money. Her family's expectations for her were modest by the standards of the colonial elite, but entirely beyond what Bellamy could offer. The two began a relationship. The relationship produced a child. The child died in infancy, and Maria Howlet was imprisoned by the Eastham community for what the Puritan culture of coastal Massachusetts called lewdness, the bearing of a child outside marriage. She was eventually released and spent years afterward living on the margins of Eastham society, the subject of folklore so dark that she eventually became known in Cape Cod legend as Goody Howlet, the Sea Witch, the woman who called up storms. Bellamy's response to this situation, to the death of his child, to the imprisonment of the woman he loved, to the social system that had punished her for his actions while he faced no consequences at all, was to leave. Not to disappear in shame, but to leave with a stated intention to come back rich. The poverty that had made him invisible to Maria's family was the obstacle, and he intended to remove it. He told people he would return with money enough to marry her on his own terms. Whether he believed this when he said it is unknowable. But it shaped everything that came after. Bellamy fell in with a man named Palsgrave Williams, the son of a Rhode Island merchant family with connections and some capital. Williams was not poor. He was a trained goldsmith who had a respectable trade and a family. What he was, fundamentally, was bored and adventurous in a way that respectability could not contain. The two men formed a partnership based on a shared plan to salvage gold from a Spanish treasure fleet that had wrecked off the coast of Florida in 1715. The fleet of 12 ships carrying treasure from the Spanish colonies had been devastated by a hurricane near what is now the Sebastian Inlet on Florida's Atlantic coast. The Spanish had immediately begun salvage operations, recovering a significant portion of the gold and silver before the wrecks buried themselves deeper in the sand. But by the time Bellamy and Williams arrived in 1715, the best material was gone. The Spanish were still working the site with armed salvage vessels, and the unofficial salvagers who had come from across the Atlantic, hoping for easy wealth, were competing for whatever the Spanish had left. Bellamy and Williams came away with almost nothing. The venture that was supposed to make them rich had made them poorer. They were in the Caribbean with no money, no prospects, and skills that were worth nothing in the legitimate economy. The transition from here to piracy is not difficult to understand. It was not a moral collapse. It was a rational response to the available options. In 1716, Bellamy and Williams joined the crew of a pirate captain named Benjamin Hornigold, one of the founding figures of the Golden Age and the man who would eventually recruit Blackbeard into the profession. Hornigold operated out of the Bahamas, using the harbor at Nassau as a base. He was by the standards of the trade a relatively principled pirate, which in practice meant he preferred not to attack English ships, a restriction that his crew increasingly resented since English ships were as plentiful and profitable as any other flag. The Nassau pirates of this period called themselves the Flying Gang, and they operated under a set of principles that were radical by the standards of any organization of the time. The pirate articles that governed their operations were not unique to Bellamy's crew, but he extended them further than most. Every man on a pirate vessel under these articles had a vote on major decisions. The captain could be removed by vote. The quartermaster, not the captain, controlled the distribution of goods taken in prizes. Every man received a share of the proceeds based on his role, with no man receiving nothing and the captain receiving only a modest premium over the ordinary sailor. Compare this to the Royal Navy, where men were pressed into service, paid irregularly if at all, subject to flogging and hanging at an officer's discretion, and received no share of any prize. Compare it to the merchant fleet, where sailors were paid fixed wages regardless of the profitability of the voyage, and had no voice in any decision. The pirate articles were, by any honest assessment, the most democratic employment contract available to working men in the early 18th century. Bellamy understood this and articulated it explicitly when given the chance. The speech attributed to Bellamy when he captured a merchant captain named Beer, who refused to join the pirates on religious and moral grounds, is one of the most remarkable statements in the historical record of piracy. Bellamy told Beer that he was sorry Beer chose to work for men who flogged their employees for insolence, while Bellamy's men were free men who robbed the rich and answered to no one. He called them a free prince and urged Beer to consider who the real thieves were, the pirates who took openly or the merchants and governors who robbed the poor under cover of law. The speech may have been embellished by the journalist who recorded it, but its core argument reflects a philosophy that appears consistently in Bellamy's actions throughout his career. He recruited aggressively from the crews of captured vessels, and many men chose to join him. From the moment Bellamy took command in 1716, he operated with an efficiency and boldness that rapidly made him one of the most significant pirate captains in the Atlantic. He and Williams cruised the Caribbean and the Atlantic seaboard, taking prizes with a combination of aggression and tactical intelligence that distinguished his campaign from the more opportunistic operations of lesser captains. His first major ship was the Sultana, a former slave vessel he renamed and made his flagship. But the Sultana was a relatively small vessel, suitable for raiding, but not for the kind of large-scale operations Bellamy was building toward. He needed something bigger, and in February of 1717, he found it. The Whydah Gally was a purpose-built slave ship that had been constructed in London in 1715. It was a fast, heavily armed vessel designed to carry enslaved Africans from the West African coast to the Caribbean, with enough guns to defend against the pirates that preyed on the slave trade routes. On its second voyage, loaded with sugar, indigo, ivory, and gold dust acquired in the Caribbean after delivering its human cargo, it encountered Bellamy's small fleet near the Bahamas. The chase lasted 3 days. The Whydah was fast, but Bellamy's vessels were faster and more numerous. The captain of the Whydah, Lawrence Prince, eventually accepted the inevitable and surrendered. Bellamy gave Prince the Sultana in exchange for the Whydah, a trade that was notably generous by pirate standards. He transferred his flag to the Whydah, armed it with more guns from captured vessels until it carried 28 cannon, and made it the flagship of what was becoming a genuine fleet. At its height, Bellamy's fleet consisted of the Whydah and 2 companion vessels, the Mary Ann and the Fisher, along with several smaller sloops and prizes being sailed to ports for disposal. He had somewhere between 150 and 200 men under his command, drawn from across the Atlantic world, including English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh, French, Dutch, African, and Caribbean sailors. Why Bellamy turned north in April of 1717 is not completely documented, but the most straightforward interpretation of the historical and legendary record is that he was going back to Cape Cod. He had been gone for roughly 2 years. He had the wealth he had promised to return with. The accounts that survive suggest he planned to winter in New England, reunite with Maria Howlet, and either retire from piracy or use the Whydah as the base for further operations from a New England harbor. He came north along the American coast, taking prizes as he went, including the Mary Ann, a small vessel carrying Madeira wine, which he captured near Virginia and incorporated into his fleet with its original crew still aboard as reluctant participants. He was, by any measure, the wealthiest and most successful active pirate in the Atlantic world. He was 28 years old. He reached the waters off Cape Cod on the night of April 26, 1717. The weather had been deteriorating all day. The winds were building from the northeast, the direction that produces the most dangerous conditions for sailing vessels approaching the Cape Cod coast, because the prevailing current runs south along the outer beach, and the shoals extend further offshore than the charts of the period accurately showed. Bellamy's pilots knew the waters were dangerous. What they did not know, and could not know from the open ocean in building conditions at night, was exactly where the shoals began. The storm hit with full force around midnight. It was a nor'easter, the kind of storm that Cape Cod residents had lived with and feared for generations. The winds reached hurricane force. The seas built to heights that made any seamanship essentially impossible. The Whydah, a large, heavily laden vessel with considerable freeboard, was particularly vulnerable to the combination of wind and wave that a nor'easter produces in those waters. In the early hours of April 27, 1717, the Whydah struck a shoal off Wellfleet on the outer coast of Cape Cod. The impact and the subsequent pounding by the storm seas broke the vessel apart within minutes. A ship that had been the most powerful pirate vessel on the Atlantic, carrying more wealth than almost any vessel afloat, disintegrated in the surf. Of the approximately 140 men aboard the Whydah, only 2 survived. Thomas Davis, a Welsh carpenter who had been forced into Bellamy's crew and had repeatedly petitioned to be released, managed to reach the shore alive. John Julian, a Mosquito Indian from Central America, who was one of the most experienced sailors aboard, also survived. Every other man on the Whydah died in the surf or on the beach. Samuel Bellamy's body was recovered on the beach the following days. He was identified by his clothing. He was 28 years old. He had been a pirate captain for approximately 14 months. In that time, he had accumulated more wealth than any pirate before him, and as far as the historical record shows, any pirate after him. The Mary Ann and the Fisher, the companion vessels, were also caught in the storm. The Mary Ann was wrecked near Poche Island, and its crew, including the involuntary Madeira wine merchants, was captured by local authorities and eventually tried in Boston. The Fisher managed to escape the worst of the storm, and its fate is less clearly documented. The survivors from the Mary Ann were brought to Boston for trial. The proceedings were conducted under the jurisdiction of the Admiralty Court, and they produced some of the most detailed contemporary documentation of Bellamy's operations that exists. The men on trial included both genuine pirates from Bellamy's crew and the involuntary passengers from the wine merchant vessel who had been pressed into service and wanted nothing more than to prove they had been captives rather than willing participants. The judge in the case, Samuel Sewall, was one of the most prominent jurists in colonial Massachusetts, a man who had sat on the Salem witchcraft trials 25 years earlier and had publicly repented of his role in them. The Bellamy piracy trials were conducted with more care than the witchcraft proceedings, and the court made genuine attempts to distinguish between willing pirates and involuntary captives. 7 men were hanged at Charlestown Ferry in November of 1717. Their bodies were displayed in chains on the waterfront as the standard warning to others considering the profession. The involuntary captives were released. Thomas Davis, whose consistent story of forced service was supported by multiple witnesses, was acquitted. John Julian, the Mosquito sailor who had survived the wreck, was never tried. He was sold into slavery. The racial mathematics of colonial New England meant that his survival was not treated as a legal matter, but as a property one. His subsequent fate is not documented in any surviving record, which is itself a documentation of the indifference of the system he had encountered. The Whydah lay on the bottom of the Atlantic in approximately 14 to 16 feet of water off Wellfleet for 269 years. Local salvagers had picked over the wreck in the immediate aftermath of the sinking, and various attempts at more systematic salvage had been made over the centuries, but the shifting sands of the outer cape continuously buried and reburied the wreck's remains. In 1984, a treasure hunter named Barry Clifford located the main deposit of the Whydah's wreckage using archival research and underwater survey. In 1985, a bronze bell was recovered from the site, bearing the inscription, "The Whydah Gally, 1717." This inscription confirmed beyond any reasonable doubt that the wreck was Bellamy's flagship. The excavation that followed over subsequent decades recovered tens of thousands of artifacts from the site: cannon, rigging hardware, personal effects from the crew including shoes, combs, navigation instruments, and weapons. Coins from across the Atlantic world, including Spanish reals, English shillings, and West African gold dust that had come aboard in the Whydah's slave trading days. A significant portion of the treasure that Bellamy had accumulated, the gold and silver and jewelry and trade goods from 50 captured vessels, was buried in the sand off Cape Cod. The Whydah collection is now the only fully authenticated pirate treasure in the world. Not treasure associated with pirates, not alleged pirate artifacts, but confirmed archaeologically documented material from a known pirate vessel in a known historical event. It is housed at a museum in Provincetown on Cape Cod, within sight of the waters where the Whydah went down, and it represents the most complete physical record of Golden Age piracy anywhere on Earth. Maria Howlet survived the storm that killed Bellamy by some years. The historical record of her life after the wreck is fragmentary, as it is for the years before, but she lived into middle age in the Eastham and Wellfleet area, never married, and occupied an increasingly isolated position in the community. The folklore that grew around her amplified with time. She became associated in Cape Cod oral tradition with the storm itself, with the idea that her grief or her anger had called up the nor'easter that killed her lover. Whether she knew immediately that Bellamy had died is not documented. The wreck was local news, and the bodies that washed up on the outer beach were a matter of community observation. But whether anyone told her specifically that the pirate captain whose ship had wrecked was Samuel Bellamy, the man she had known years earlier as an impoverished sailor, is unknown. The community had every reason to treat her with a mixture of fascination and hostility, and the folklore suggests that is exactly what they did. The legend of Goody Howlet, the Sea Witch of Wellfleet, is one of the oldest and most persistent in Cape Cod folklore. She is described in various versions as living in a shack on the outer beach, talking to the wind, consorting with the devil, calling ships onto the shoals. These are the stories that communities tell about women who step outside the boundaries assigned to them and survive. Maria Howlet had a child outside marriage at 17, was imprisoned for it, was abandoned by the man responsible, and then outlived that man by decades while the community watched. The transformation of that story into supernatural legend is a documented pattern in the oral history of New England. The truth underneath the legend is more human and more interesting. A young woman from Eastham was used and abandoned by a man who promised to come back and did not. The man died rich in the sea on his way to her. She never knew whether to grieve or rage, and the community that had already judged her had no language for the complexity of what she felt. Bellamy was called Black Sam by his contemporaries, a nickname whose origins are disputed, but that most historians attribute to his habit of wearing his own black hair unpowdered rather than the fashionable white wigs of the era. He was described by contemporaries as tall, dark-featured, and physically impressive. He wore a black coat. He carried multiple pistols. He had the bearing of a man who had decided that the conventions of his society did not apply to him. His legacy in the history of piracy is built on three things. The first is the scale of his achievement. In 14 months of active piracy, he accumulated more wealth than any other documented pirate. The treasure on the Whydah at the time of its sinking represented the capture of over 50 prize vessels and the consolidation of their cargoes into a single hold. The $4.5 million estimate is in modern valuation. In 1717 terms, it was a sum that would have bought several large English estates. The second is his philosophy. The speech to Captain Beer, the Democratic Articles, the consistent pattern of treating captured sailors differently based on how their own captains had treated them. These are not the actions of a man who saw himself as simply a thief. Bellamy understood himself as living proof that the system he had been born into was arbitrary and unjust, and his piracy was a demonstration of that understanding. He was a class warrior who happened to operate on the sea. The third is the Whydah itself. Because the ship went down in shallow water and was eventually archaeologically recovered, Bellamy is the only Golden Age pirate whose story can be told in concrete material terms rather than purely through documents. The artifacts in Provincetown are not simply pirate memorabilia. They are evidence of how a diverse crew of men from across the Atlantic world lived, worked, and died in the most radical workplace democracy available to them in their time. He was 28 years old. He had been a pirate for 14 months. He was the richest sea robber who ever lived, and he died with the tide before he reached the shore. Samuel Bellamy spent less than 2 years as a pirate and became the wealthiest sea robber who ever lived. He gave his crew a democracy when the world gave them nothing. He died at 28 with millions in his hold and a woman on Cape Cod who spent the rest of her life not knowing what had happened to him.